Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. We're so glad you can be here for our conversation, Voting Rights for Incarcerated Californians. This is a program hosted by California on the Ballot, which is California Humanities Civic Initiative, now in its second season. Thank you all for making time to join us today, and thanks to our panelists. My name is Kirsten Vega. I organized the series, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Brady Heiner, Marilyn Ralston, and Andrew Dilts. I'll say just a few more words about today's program, and then I'll give the floor to Dr. Heiner, who is going to moderate today. If you're not familiar with California Humanities, we are an independent nonprofit organization and partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, who has generously supported this event and the California on the Ballot series through their initiative, A More Perfect Union, which commemorates the 250th anniversary of the United States in all its complications and possibilities. And since 1975, California Humanities has produced, funded, and supported a range of humanities projects and programs in every congressional corner of California. So with that in mind, California on the Ballot, our civic initiative, is a free series of virtual events where we reflect on what civic engagement looks like in California today, examine its roots in state history, also national history, and at times international history. And we ask what changes might soon be in store, whether that's a legislative change, a cultural change, or something else in the zeitgeist that our speakers are noticing. Today's program is the fourth in our second season, which has used the theme Barriers to Voting, although that theme has been greatly expanded by the conversations in this series. Today, the topic is voting rights for people who are currently or have been recently incarcerated in California's prison system, and also how those people continue to be civically and politically engaged within the conditions of carceral confinement. So please take a look into the chat for more details about our speakers, their work, this program, and also feel free to put questions in the Q&A. I think we'll take them. You can certainly write in on a rolling basis, and around 11:50, we'll switch and start taking questions from the audience, with the program ending at 12:15. Okay, lastly, to introduce Dr. Heiner. Dr. Brady Heiner is Associate Professor of Philosophy and the affiliated faculty of African American Studies at California State University, Fullerton. He specializes in critical theory. Publications include Feminism and the Carceral State, The Procedural Entrapment of Mass Incarceration, and The Unfinished Project of American Abolition. Heiner grew up in the Central Valley during the California prison boom, where there are today more prisons per capita than institutions of higher learning. He's the founding director of Project Rebound at CSU Fullerton, a network of 14 on-campus programs that support the higher education and successful reintegration of formerly incarcerated people through equitable access, services, care, and much more. So with that, over to you, Dr. Heiner, and thank you all.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you to California Humanities for hosting this event and for selecting such an urgent topic. And thanks to the panelists for joining us today. It's my honor to introduce to you Andrew Dilts. Dr. Dilts is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Loyola Marymount University. He's a political theorist who works in the traditions of critical theory and the history of political thought, focusing primarily on the relationships between race, sexuality, political membership, sovereignty, and punishment in the United States. Dilts is the author of Punishment and Inclusion, Race, Membership, and the Limits of American Liberalism, which gives a theoretical and historical account of criminal disenfranchisement in the United States. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Dilts. And Romarilyn Ralston, it's my pleasure to introduce her. She is the program director of Project Rebound at Cal State Fullerton and the chair of the CSU Project Rebound Consortium Policy and Advocacy Committee, a Black feminist prison abolitionist scholar working to interrupt criminalization at the intersections of race, gender, and education. Ralston is the recipient of numerous degrees and awards, including California State Senator Ling Ling Chang's 2020 Women of Distinction Social Justice Champion Award. Ralston was a 2018 Fellow of the Women's Policy Institute, where as a member of the Criminal Justice Reform Team, she helped to pass several pieces of legislation into law. So to begin our conversation today, I wonder to both of our panelists, how do you situate yourself with respect to the topic of our panel today, voting rights for incarcerated Californians? What brings you to this issue?
I guess I'll go first. Thank you, Brady. Thank you, Kirsten, for having us today on this panel, and thanks to the California Humanities for sponsoring this conversation today. As you said, Brady, you know, my bio says a lot about me, other than I spent 23 years behind bars, incarcerated at the California Institution for Women, and had only voted once prior to incarceration. And so this topic is very important to me. And I think that civic engagement is a duty for those who have been disenfranchised because of criminalization. And that's how I come to this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks for that. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great first question. And I definitely come to this particular topic with sort of from two different sides. And I wear those two different hats sort of simultaneously, I think. One of them, I think, is obvious from my introduction, that I'm a scholar of race, punishment, and civic membership. My academic scholarly work focuses on the long history of exclusions to the franchise that have pointed to specific disqualifications for membership. And I can speak, at greater length about sort of that particular history in the United States. And so, I've written a book about this, and I've studied this, and I've tried to incorporate it into my work as an academic, what it means to think about the way we define who we are as a community by those whom we exclude, particularly when we frequently speak about being a nation of universal suffrage, where universal is always stated in opposition to the numerous people who are not actually welcomed into the franchise. But I also come to this as somebody who was born and raised in the United States, and who is one of the 1 in 2 people in the United States who is closely connected to somebody who has served time in a jail or prison in the United States. While we often may think of this as incarceration as something that impacts a relative minority of people, the United States is a country of the highest per capita rates of incarceration in the world, affects everyone. And it affects people who are directly impacted by it, but it also shapes the world that people who have not experienced incarceration live in. So for me, I also come to this as somebody who has family who are in law enforcement, family who work in jails and prisons, and family who are currently serving long sentences in criminal confinement. And as I said, that in the United States, 1 in 2 people is closely connected to somebody who is currently or has recently been incarcerated. That's the scale of this. And one of the things I'll speak to hopefully today is, even if you don't have a direct connection to incarceration in the United States, the fact we live in a prison society like the United States shapes everything that we do, in the same ways that in previous centuries, you need not live in a slave state to live in a slave society. We live in a similar sort of structure today. So I come to it both of those things. I'm both a scholar of this question, but I'm also, as somebody who was born and raised and lived in the United States most of my life, someone who's directly affected by incarceration, even if I'm affected differentially from other people.
Yeah, thank you both for kicking us off in that way, and for tracing those connections between ourselves on the outside and those who are incarcerated, and the trajectory that folks travel in between those spaces and our connections to them. As Angela Y. Davis argues, prisons function to disappear people rather than to address the social problems that those people are often grappling with. So I really appreciate you both foregrounding our connections with folks who are currently incarcerated. It's a wonderful way to start. I think for those of our audience who are unfamiliar with some of the factual and historical kind of context for this question, perhaps we could start there. So what current policies do California and other US states enforce around voting and civic participation for incarcerated citizens? And how has this evolved through America's early history, and how does race weave into this story?
Well, maybe I can just try and do this, the concise sort of academic side of this very, very briefly, if that's okay. I mean, I think one of the things that many people perhaps know from their experience, if they've lived in the United States for a while and they voted, is that voting rights in the United States are to use actually a quote from interviews with state election officials years ago, quote unquote, crazy quilt of patterns. That the United States, unlike many other Western developed countries, has a few broad federal oversights on voting rights, but for almost the most part, all voting rights and the administration of voting happens at the state level. This means that there's a huge amount of variation across the United States in terms of qualifications and disqualifications to the right to vote. And it also means that across history, there's been a couple of sort of key periods of the ebb and flow of who's included in the franchise. And I think people are largely familiar with some of the sort of the big reconstitutions of the United States in terms of voting rights, right? So the early extension of voting rights to white working men in the 1820s and 1830s is a radical reconstruction of who constitutes, what constitutes American citizenship. The Reconstruction amendments following the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, likewise by enfranchising African-American men, is a radical reconstruction of who counts as a member of the voting public. The women's suffrage movement in the early part of the 20th century, likewise, reconstitutes or changes who counts as an American. And then maybe to sort of a lesser degree in terms of public sentiment, right, the extension of voting rights to people under the age of 21 to 18-year-olds during the Vietnam War period, right? There's sort of these kind of, four big moments, right? And interestingly, during that same period of time, right, this is also when the right to vote has to be assured by the federal government in the United States through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965 and on, right? So even having guarantees of the rights has never been a sufficient means for that. Specifically, the exclusion of individuals who've been convicted of crimes stretches all the way back to colonial era policies in the United States. Although in the colonial period, there were often restrictions for very specific and very narrow things. Public drunkenness, for instance, would often lose you the right to vote in the Virginia colony. Various crimes against the church would be the kinds of things you would lose the right to vote for. In the colonial and early revolutionary period, it would often be a very specific thing, right? So that you'd be convicted of a crime, and a part of the sentence for the conviction of the crime would be, and you lose your right to take part in public deliberation. This is, of course, narrowly restricted to people who would have the right to vote, which was already a very small number of people during that period. What we see just historically in the broad strokes, though, is for every moment of those sort of big expansions of the American voting public, there's always a sort of secondary retraction that comes immediately with or after it, right? Every time American populations or US populations debate this question or change it, there's always a 2 steps forward, maybe 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 3 steps back sort of moment. There's always a bit of an ebb and flow. And historically, one of the things that often is invoked in that moment, right, when a systematic qualification is open, a group of people are entered into it, will be a moment where you can read this in the debates of constitutional state conventions. There's a concern over letting the wrong people in. Right. And that in the American tradition is often tracked to something like conviction of or affiliation with crime. Immediately following the Civil War, there's huge debates in the North about whether people who traveled to the South to fight for the Confederacy would be allowed to regain their rights or not. There's always this persistent question of like, what does it take to disqualify yourself from suffrage? And it always comes at that moment of expansion and then sort of an immediate contraction afterwards. Which is just to say, right, that we find ourselves today in the United States at a point where 48 states in the United States have some form of a restriction on voting rights that's coincident to a felony conviction, right? And that's sort of the standard form here. It's no longer, and it's almost never, part of a criminal sentence. Nobody gets sent to prison for 18 months and loses their rights. It's almost always triggered by the fact of a sentence, right? So this is why scholars of crime and punishment will refer to felon disenfranchisement or criminal disenfranchisement as a collateral consequence, right? It's something that happens because you've been convicted, not for your conviction, right? It's not something that's part of the debt that you owe society, but it's something because there's a systematic or a character-based disqualification. Of those 48 states, all of the 50 states, all but two, you lose your rights to vote on the moment of a felony status conviction. In around 21 states, and California will find itself in this category only recently, since the passage of Prop 17 2 years ago. The right to vote be restricted while you are currently incarcerated. Beyond that, I think it's an additional 15 or 16 states where the right to vote is continued to be restricted even after you've left prison, but while you're completing your sentence, be it on probation or parole. And in a handful of states, somewhere around 10 or 11, depending on what we do with Florida, we'll talk about Florida, I think, at some point here. It's quite likely that barring a full pardon or a gubernatorial act of clemency, the right to vote is never necessarily regained. Right, so that disenfranchisement can in fact be permanent even after one's criminal sentence has been served. So that changes depending on where you are. It's entirely possible that if you move states in the US that your rights can come and go depending on the jurisdiction that you're under. It's also incredibly difficult in many states to know exactly how one's rights are restored, whether they're automatically restored immediately after leaving jail or after finishing one's probation. There are huge risks in getting this wrong. We've seen stories of individuals who thought that their rights had been restored, but because they hadn't gone through the process, have in fact voted illegally and have risked re-incarceration on the basis of parole and probation violations for voting illegally, so to speak, precisely because it was unclear of how one's rights could be restored. It's hard, in fact, to talk sort of generally about what it is that constitutes criminal disenfranchisement in the US. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet for a moment, right, is there is no way to tell this story in the United States without recognizing that it's a story about race in the United States. So at one level, this is the case in that we can trace the origin of these exclusions to states like Mississippi and Alabama, which on the floor of their congressional delegations would debate on exactly which crimes should constitute disenfranchisement on the basis of which crimes would be likely to be committed by one group of people or another. Such that in Alabama at one point, murder was not a disenfranchisable crime, but chicken theft was, right? This is an express way of engaging in open racial discrimination. There's a second story as well, which I think is always the case, is that one of the things we do in the United States when we talk about race is we talk about how race is not just a fact of existence that people are discriminatory against or in support of, but it's something that's created and recreated through how we think about our community and who's a member. And as I've argued elsewhere, right, how we extend the rights of civic engagement and how we restrict those is sometimes how we renegotiate race, how we think about what it means to count as normatively white or what it means to be outside of the protections of white supremacy as a political system. You can track sort of some of those moments, right? It's perhaps not a coincidence. Those two states which have no restrictions whatsoever are Maine and Vermont, two of the whitest states in the Union. And one of the ways in which they're the whitest states in the Union, in fact, is an understanding of civic participation and membership, where the violation of its laws need not exclude you from taking part in civic politics. I'll stop there if that gets us started.
Yeah, no, thanks for that helpful background, both historical and legal. And I appreciate the way that you highlight the way in which that trajectory is animated by a fundamental question about how we think about our own community, how we think about the civic community. And so I'm curious, Romarilyn in particular, to draw these connections between this history and the current legal framework. to our community members who are currently incarcerated. How have these policies affected incarcerated people and people with felony convictions in California? What is it like, and what are some of the forms through which people continue to be civically and politically engaged from within conditions of carceral confinement?
Oh, thank you, Brady, for that question. And thank you, Andrew, for that historical journey. And you spoke so brilliantly about civic participation, what that looks like. But when you were saying, how these different groups were disenfranchised, it's really all about who's deserving of being called a member of our society and what that looks like. And for folks with criminal records who've been convicted of crimes, or for Black people like me, we have always been denied certain civil liberties because we've never been, fully included as members of this society. And we continue to be disenfranchised just based on the color of our skin, sometimes our gender, sometimes our sexual orientation. So, it really boils down to what our government feel is, acceptable behavior or acceptable to be given the privilege to vote or be given the privilege to participate civically and engage in the political process in this country. It's really fascinating when you put it the way that you did. So thank you so much for sharing that. The impact of discriminatory policies impact incarcerated people differently. We come to incarceration differently from all different walks of life. Some of us are citizens and some of us aren't when we are serving time behind bars. And so that makes it a little bit more complicated. You brought into question voting being a collateral consequence. Well, there's 48,000 collateral consequences for people who have criminal convictions in this country. And so it's just so much and so many different disparities besides just losing the right to vote and to serve on juries. But, those who are incarcerated and who are not citizens of this country face deportation, which is another, I think, really cruel apparatus within this country that ships people out and disenfranchises them from their communities and their families and things that they care about. But, the hardship of incarceration when it comes to being civically engaged, it's kind of twofold because we have family and friends in the community. So we're able to influence our family and friends when it comes to, what is on the ballot, who's running for office, what is this DA's policies and practices going to be for our neighborhoods? And so we're able to then, use that power behind bars to push, candidates in a certain direction sometimes, or, that may lead to legislation. And so we've seen over the last 5 to 6 years here in California how social organizations like ARC, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, Initiate Justice, have used the power of individuals behind bars to drive policy and to increase our capacity behind bars to be civically engaged, not only in our communities, but statewide and also nationally. Civic engagement for incarcerated people can look, again, like following candidates through printed media. Folks who are incarcerated get newspapers, magazines, they have television. So we're able to follow the news, follow the candidates. But most importantly, we have connections to family and friends who can, keep us informed. But something that was really interesting when I was incarcerated and I did personally, was contribute to campaigns. You know, there is the US mail system. Folks who are incarcerated get mail. And you can sign up for newsletters. You can sign up for information. So you can get those things directly delivered to your cell door. So you can follow the candidates and you can give campaign contributions. There's so many ways for incarcerated people to stay connected civically and to engage civically that I don't think people really think about. Because as you said, Dr. Heiner, Angela White Davis says that, prisons disappear people, not social problems. And so I think the general public doesn't see incarcerated people as contributing members of society. They only see us as criminals who deserve to be locked away and taken out of the community. But, I'm here to tell you that, in the state of California, one of the biggest prison states in the country, there is a lot of engagement behind bars. Now, Initiate Justice, an organization that's led by Taina Vargas, they have over 15,000 members who are not only civically engaged, but who are producing and writing policy behind bars. So it's really fascinating to see what people are able to do and continue to do civically, although they've been arrested. And I guess lastly, I'll just say, when I was incarcerated, one of the things that we developed was a mock election. The 2008 general election was something that the whole world was watching. And incarcerated people were also watching this transpire. And we created inside the California Institution for Women, a mock election. We transformed the auditorium into a voting booth. We had sample ballots. We had I voted tags that we gave to folks, but we also had literature that had come in from the outside to inform us about the candidates and what platforms they were running on and what they planned to do. And so there's a huge interest behind bars on what's happening in our communities, because as you know, 95% of those incarcerated return to the community. And so it is extremely important that those who we confine behind bars are civically engaged and knowledgeable of the issues of the day, whether they are local, state, or national, because we are involved, if not personally, through our families, through our friends, through our interests, but most importantly, because we return back to our communities. And as you laid out, Andrew, many of the states refranchise those with felony convictions, so they do vote. And so we've seen in California over the years that not only have voting rights been restored for those who are on probation and parole, but also through SB 310, we're able to participate on jury service. And many formerly incarcerated people want to serve on juries. We feel that we have this kind of inside information about how people commit crimes, why they commit crimes, and whether or not they deserve incarceration. And so we've seen here in California a number of state legislators, Senator Nancy Skinner, Assembly Member Ash Kara, then Senator Holly Mitchell, and so many more, pass really progressive legislation that supports the formerly incarcerated and incarcerated community.
Yeah, thank you for that. So since you've moved us toward legislation, let's talk about a couple of recent laws. So in 2018, 65% of Florida voters passed Amendment 4, a constitutional amendment that automatically restored voting rights to as many as 1.4 million Floridians who had completed the terms of their sentences. And as you mentioned, Romarilyn, in 2020, California passed Proposition 17, a similar constitutional amendment that automatically restored voting rights to 50,000 Californians on parole for felony convictions. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and the Florida State Senate quickly and effectively nullified that constitutional restoration by signing Senate Bill 7066. So what are these constitutional amendments in two very different states on opposite coasts of the United States? And what are the struggles and the reversals that surround them? What do they tell us about this moment? How should we be thinking about the relationship between carcerality and political engagement?
Well, I think just quickly, one of the things that unites those two states, Florida and California, besides being, on, I don't know, geographic extremity or something, is they're two of the states with the largest incarcerated populations in the United States, right? They're massive states in the first place, but also there are two states that have a huge proportion of their populations who are experiencing incarceration or have experienced incarceration, right? And I think also what unites those two things is that when the question of voting rights is quote unquote put to the people, right, in ballot initiatives like you see in California in Prop 17 and you saw in Amendment 4 in Florida, that the people, as oddly constituted as we may be at certain moments, know folks for whom the carceral system and incarceration is not merely a metaphor. It's not something off in the distance. And so when this question is in fact put to people under the conditions that we live under in the United States, which is a condition of mass incarceration, where a huge number of people are incarcerated, and that number of people is not randomly drawn, but is systematically concentrated along lines of race, around lines of class, along lines of gender variation and difference, right? That when you put the question to the people, and when the people are able to mobilize through grassroots movements, which is exactly what we saw in Florida and exactly what we saw in California, you see that the question of who belongs and who should be able to take part is not a settled question, right? It's not something that is simply a piece of campaign fodder for elected officials. So there's something telling about the fact that when this question is put to the mass public, even the mass public that's under the conditions of disenfranchisement, right? You do in fact see people pushing back against this basic idea that somehow the worst thing you've ever done in your life is disqualifying of being part of a community, even if it's not even the worst thing you've ever done in your life, right? Even if it's not even something you did in your life. So there's something I think really important about that unites those two cases, right? One of the things we also see in Florida, interestingly, right, if political science geeks who want to look at the county level data, right, is that counties that went hard for Republican candidates in the gubernatorial race also went hard for Amendment 4. Right? There isn't a clean partisan story also to tell about this. And in fact, the history of disenfranchisement is a bipartisan project, right? And while there may be some variation around different policies, the basic question, at least at elite politics level, that there should be some sort of collateral consequence to incarceration that would restrict someone of their votes, right? Democrats and Republicans they vary in their position on this on the extremity, but there's basically maybe I would say, unfortunately, a bipartisan consensus on this question, right? And when you put that question to the people, I think there's real pushback on that, right? We can't tell a simple, this is a Democrat or Republican issue story about this. Or if we do tell that story, that's not exactly a description of what's happened, especially when grassroots mobilizations, when people coming together to do civic engagement work about civic engagement, right, tells us, I think, a different story. I think that's just one place to start on that.
Yeah, Romarilyn?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things. Thank you, Andrew, for that. And, you mentioned the people. The people are tired of the people being disenfranchised and discriminated against. And so when you see this kind of rising up of folks and saying, we don't want our tax dollars going to supporting prisons and jails. California spends over $30 billion in corrections. So if you don't have a loved one who's incarcerated, if you're not directly connected to incarceration. You are through your tax dollars. And so we all have this kind of invested interest in the governance and the good governance of the people that we elect to run our states and how they use those monies. But when the people come together and they support Amendment 4, they support Prop 17, what I saw with both of those movements was, incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people and their families coming together and saying no more. They say that when a person is incarcerated, their families are incarcerated too. And so there's this rippling effect of what happens to a person when they are incarcerated impacts their family. And they not only pay the burden of supporting that person who's incarcerated, but then there's all this social stigma. And also, our families are locked out of getting resources sometimes from the state because they have a family member who's incarcerated, especially if it is a spouse or a son or a daughter, And so there's this other quote, you'll like this, Brady, by Angela Y. Davis. She says, I can no longer accept the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I can no longer accept. And that's what we saw in California with Prop 17. The people saying, we can no longer accept this disenfranchisement. We can no longer accept that folks who have served their sentence are now returning to the community, paying their taxes, living respectably, but can't have the right to vote. And we saw it in Florida when the people said, we're going to pass Amendment 4, and they voted to say that folks deserve to not only have opportunities to work, go to school, etc., but to participate civically and be engaged. I think we're seeing that across this country in all of our social movements, whether it's around voting rights, voter suppression, or just social justice, period. We're seeing this massive uprising of people who are saying no more. We want to live in a country that is supposed to be about all of us, not some of us.
Yeah, thank you for exploring some of those connections. And Romarilyn, for speaking to the way that incarceration also not just affects the person incarcerated, but incarcerates the whole family. A number of folks have argued and pointed to the ways in which carceral institutions function as institutions that produce social and civic death, that isolate and separate members of our community from their community members on the outside. And one of the things that I think was really inspiring as someone involved with Project Rebound, which is a network of programs across the state of California that provides equitable access, communities of belonging, and infrastructures of care for formerly incarcerated people to access higher education, was, so how motivated, how engaged, how willing and excited so many of our students coming out, sometimes after long sentences, how excited they are to be engaged, to participate. And around the mobilizations that you mentioned around Florida's Amendment 4 and California's Prop 17, I remember hearing from students who traveling to Florida around the mobilizations, so California students, right, traveling to Florida and suddenly finding themselves, connected to a national conversation, to a national mobilization, and to a national movement of similarly situated and similarly, objecting people and their family members, and some of those students have become very involved in various ways in California, which is one of the, I think, wonderful aspects of providing equitable access to folks in institutions of higher education, is that there are platforms available for folks to become engaged, to exercise leadership. And so I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about and you've mentioned, Romarilyn, you've mentioned it earlier when referencing Initiate Justice and the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. You both mentioned the mobilization of formerly incarcerated people and their family members around these two constitutional amendments in very different states. An ecosystem of organizations and policymakers has developed over the last decade or so in California, through which the perspectives and the advocacy of currently and formerly incarcerated people and their families are significantly influencing policy. Tell us a little bit more about that ecosystem. What roles are formerly incarcerated people playing? And what are some of the policies that have recently grown from this ecosystem in California? And why should our audience think they're important?
Andrew, did you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brady, for the question. Yeah, as I mentioned, the last 5 or 6 years have been really powerful here in California. We've seen a number of grassroots organizations form extremely powerful coalitions to move criminal justice reform in a really progressive way. Not just Anti-Recidivism Coalition and Initiate Justice, but the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights leading the way, ACLU. We've seen students from Project Rebound, Underground Scholars, Rising Scholars Network, all band together with legislators to think about ways in which we can improve our communities for all people. And I think we've seen more legislators really passionate about rolling back and undoing some of those draconian laws that were set up during the tough on crime, war on drug period that really, I think, shifted the landscape of California to where we had this huge prison expansion that I know Andrew can talk a lot about, and you as well, Brady, where we built 20 prisons within the course of a couple of decades. But what we've seen was the way that legislators now look at the huge state budget and try to figure out ways to not just re-enfranchise those who have been disenfranchised, but how we can really make our communities safer and healthier for all people. And we're talking about access to not just jobs, but access to education, access to healthcare, access to clean community, clean energy. So there's all of that too, I think, that's driving this ecosystem that you're talking about. We're just thinking smarter and thinking differently about how we're using our tax dollars and how we are building the communities and the society that we want. We're no longer the baby boomers. Well, I'm a baby boomer, but these millennials, Generation X and Y and Z, and all of these kids who are now stepping into these positions of power, just think differently. We've seen the youth movement across this country and how it has shifted the climate and how we think about social justice, how we participate in civil disobedience, if you want to say it's civil disobedience, but just in protest. And so we've learned so much from the current movements on how to be smarter, do better, but I'll say this in the end, but how to be inclusive, how to really be diverse in our communities and bring all of the voices to the table, all of the stakeholders to the table, all those who laws impact and policies and regulations impact. This generation has taught us that everyone's voice matters and everyone is important and that everyone is deserving. And we didn't have this 20 years ago, but we have it today. And I think if we pay attention and we continue to follow the lead of the youth that we have leading this movement, we're going to be much better off 20 years from now.
Yeah, I would only just add to that, because I think, Marilyn, you're absolutely right to note that one of the things that's changed in the last 20 years is a groundswell shift of where the leadership on a lot of these questions is coming from. And so if you look back at the sort of late 90s and early 2000s around some of these questions, a lot of the big mainstream civil rights organizations were they didn't want to come near this question, right? They weren't nowhere to be found, but there was often a hesitancy, right? Because I mean, the memories of the 1980s, the memories of the Willie Horton ad, the memories of how effective it could be politically to invoke the specter, right? Or the idea of like some sort of radical criminal other had not been lost on people, right? And so, one of these sort of key moments, right, that sort of shifted that instance was Bush v. Gore in 2000 is probably one of the first major presidential elections where, because you get this interesting moment where an intense amount of focus zeroes in on one specific jurisdiction, Florida, which has one of the highest disenfranchisement rates in the country, where we become obsessed over these tiny margins, a margin that would make the difference in two trajectories of political power for the next 4 to 8 years. What was lost in that moment is that the number of people who were wrongly disenfranchised by the state's own admission, that is, people who are on the rolls for disenfranchisement incorrectly, was larger than the vote margins in Miami-Dade County. And the number of people disenfranchised wholesale in Florida just simply overwhelmed the kind of narrow margins by which electoral victories were being counted, right? And in a certain sense, 2000 is kind of this funny moment where it becomes very clear that we may not even be having a conversation about who wins Florida if it weren't for this long history and the cumulative effect of voter suppression in a variety of forms. And here's just one, where literally even the incorrect names on the list, forget whether they're correct or not, right? Whether there should be a list or not. The number of incorrect names on the list, had they all voted one way or the other, would have swung the election wholesale. So one of the ways I sometimes think about it is we get really interested in vote margins like every 4 years. Like we obsess, like you get on 538 and you start worrying about what Nate Silver is going to tell us about strong states and weak states and the 2.5% here and there. And we get really interested in those margins where most of the time we're living under much larger margins of people who've been marginalized, in fact, that make those margins even matter. Right, that you wouldn't have the kinds of swing state fights that we may not have those at all. And it could go either direction, by the way, right? Again, there's not a clean partisan split on this question. And if there is, it's less about sort of fealty to one political party or not. It's about the systematic paths that lead individuals to incarceration, right? Is that being poor in this country means you're more likely to be incarcerated? Is that being racially profiled means you're more likely to be incarcerated? It means that if you're vulnerable and exposed to, being kicked out of your family because you're queer, you're more likely to be incarcerated, right? One of the questions I always want to ask is, which margins matter and which margins matter to us when? And I think one of the things that has shifted since 2000, and this coalitional work that Romarilyn points to is absolutely essential, is that a lot of those big mainstream civil rights organizations got on board because they started to realize that the margins mattered all the time, and not just every 4 years, and not just in November, or not just at the moment when the political pundits and the political scientists could come in and game out the scenario one way or the other. that I think, I'm typically a very pessimistic person, right? But that's one of those moments of great hope and optimism, or maybe a pessimistic hope, right? That it'll be from those who are most impacted by the systems that real leadership develops, because it's always been from the most impacted by the systems where the best leadership comes from, right? It's always from the margins that the clearer voices around justice are usually articulated. That's because that's where the experience of injustice is most profound, most devastating, and arguably there's a clarity that's provided in that sort of moment, right? So we're at a moment, I think, where we can follow along, or we can sort of get lost in the other direction, I think, right? And maybe one way to put that is, notice how much we have to worry about getting people back into civil society, getting people re-enfranchised, getting people reintegrated, right? Reuben Jonathan Miller's brilliant recent book, Halfway Home, talks in great detail, not just about what happens when you're incarcerated, but the long years of coming back to a community, right? We got 2 million people currently incarcerated. There are 5 million people on paper in the US right now who are under some form of supervision while they're at home, right? And one of the things that you realize when that's the case is almost all of that can be avoided if you did some of this work at the front end. Right? If you kept people out of the system, if you find ways to divest from prisons, jails, and policing and invest in things that we know produce genuine safety, deep safety, real safety. Resources make us safe. Communities make us safe. We're safest in our communities when they're not disrupted. So part of me is like, we got to fix this stuff yesterday. But a lot of this is we got to keep this thing from happening more and more and more, right? Our time is so much well spent on the front end of this, right? Of dismantling the institutions we have and putting those resources and that energy into things that have always made communities stronger and safety. Health, education, clean water, clean air, spaces to be together, eyes on the street, communities that know each other and can know each other, that do not need external forces to guard or to police them, but are the kinds of communities that all of us want to grow up in, want to raise our children in, want to have our families in. That's the front end work. And I think it's actually really important that that's part of what this current moment is about, is seeing that that's the ecosystem, right? I think that's such a great term for it. The ecosystem is on all sides of this, right? And there's a lot of places then to plug in, right? There's lots of different places to plug in and do that work. It doesn't have to just be, showing up at a campaign once every 4 years.
Yeah, thanks Andrew, the line of thought that you pursued after Romarilyn's comments were very similar to my own. You don't need to be a standpoint epistemologist, I think, to see how this ecosystem, which really centers the leadership of folks who have lived experience of the criminal legal system and have lived through its organizational abandonments, right? Have a privileged standpoint, a privileged perspective to shed light on ways in which we can reimagine public safety. And I think that's part of what this ecosystem, this groundswell of movement has accomplished and is accomplishing, is by and we see policymakers in California really listening in new ways, I think, and really calling upon formerly and currently incarcerated people, not just as stakeholders, but as experts on how to reimagine public safety. And as you both mentioned, that reimagining certainly requires that we no longer think of safety or the institutions, the public institutions that are responsible for public safety very narrowly as law enforcement and carceral institutions, but as you both speak to, institutions of educational institutions, right? Whether K through 12 on the front end, right, of the sort of preventative work, right? Thinking about diversion, thinking about providing resources and mentorship and opportunities, to higher education, health. I think it's telling that in 2023, the legislature in California has slated the Division of Juvenile Justice to close. and has relocated, has opened a new office, the Office of Youth and Community Restoration, not in the Department of Corrections, but in the Department of Health and Human Services. And so I think that would not have happened, it seems to me, were it not for the ecosystem that you both have described so well. So it has been time well spent, and this has been time well spent in conversation with the two of you. And I want to open up to our audience members the opportunity to pose questions through the Q&A function, and we would love to engage with some of the thoughts and questions that come from our audience today. So here's a question from an anonymous attendee. It says, all voters are eligible for office. I believe an incarcerated person was elected to a local commission recently. What do you think about specifically eliminating an individual from running for office, say for president? Are there any crimes that preclude some from serving?
I mean, I'll just say, so narrowly and legally, I mean, I wonder what president you have in mind there. So one of the things, I mean, not all actual voters are eligible for all offices. So maybe this is also one of those things that jurisdictions have an immense amount of leeway actually determining qualifications. Typically, one of the qualifications to stand for office is that you also be able to vote in that jurisdiction. And actually, the US presidency is actually sort of a great example. Not everyone who's a voter can be US president. The US presidency is restricted to people over the age of 35 and who are natural born citizens of the United States, right? So there's just, you know, this is sometimes the devil really is in the details about like how various qualifications and disqualifications work. Typically, though, so one of the ways this problem would have been handled historically is sort of that thing I referred to earlier, where restrictions of holding office actually would be very narrowly tailored and very specific. So in colonial law, for instance, oh, I'm sorry, my camera just turned off. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know why that happened. Let me switch that. My nice camera broke. There we go. Sorry, the lighting switched to I'm in London or Oxford right now with students, so my connection's a little strange. I apologize for that.
No problem.
One of the ways that maybe historically this would have been done, though, is part of a sentence could strip somebody of the rights to hold an office, right? And so this is maybe an important like theoretical distinction, but I actually think it has really important sort of effect here, right? So this distinction between losing the right to vote or losing the right to serve on juries or having a collateral effect is it's a way of thinking about individuals as a kind of person rather than as a culpable, responsible individuals, right? So an individual doesn't get sentenced to 18 months because they happen to be a kind of person, we hope. We hope they get sentenced because the specific thing that they did warrants or calls or they deserve that, right? And what's maybe weird or strange or unusual about voting rights restrictions or restrictions on jury service is it isn't about the specific thing you did, is that you're in the category or class of individuals we call quote unquote felons. The etymology of this is interesting. The word felons comes from the Old English and it means like a weed or something dirty and damaging to a community, right? So like the moralizing language really is in there. Like we think of people as different kinds of people here. So nothing, for instance, keeps, say, during an impeachment proceeding of high office, that part of the sanction of an impeachment would be then to bar an individual from that office. But there's something actually maybe a little like more honest, maybe a little more straightforward about doing it as a narrowly tailored thing, right? If you think that this particular violation of law, election fraud in particular, right, or stuffing a ballot box, I mean, just from sort of a theoretical or a hypothetical basis, like, okay, well, then do it in the individual case. A lot of the injustice, I think, not all of it, but a lot of the injustice of felon disenfranchisement is it isn't specific. It's widespread and it's broad. It's a scattershot that says anything connected to this. Right? You stole a car radio worth over $500 and the $500 classifies it as a felony in that jurisdiction. That's the same disqualification as somebody who engaged in a serial act of violence against children. Imagine your worst of your worst, right? I don't know why those two things have to be connected in the same way that they are by a felon disenfranchisement law, right? So I would say, like, if that's what you want to do, I have questions about that. Why should we restrict people from office? Like, the thing about democracy as it can sometimes undo itself. And maybe that's one of the dangers and the powers and the beauty of democracy is the only system of government that could vote itself out of existence. That's kind of an ever-present threat, but it's maybe an important one to have, that we have to protect and defend it in these ways, right? But I think this is a great question of like, if you wanted to do it, I'd say you should do it for that reason, for that person. The system we have doesn't even do that. The system we have makes this broad categorical assumption that says, by virtue of this very specific thing that you may or may not have done in the jurisdiction you happen to be in, and the specific qualifications in that jurisdiction, therefore you're a kind of person. And the disqualifications, when we disqualify as kinds of person, we know what that history is. That's not a democratic history. That's not an anti-racist history. That's not a anti-sexist history. That's a deeply, deeply problematic history.
We have a question from Paula Archiga. Factual question. What's the difference in California between being on parole and being on probation regarding restoring voting rights?
Post Prop 17, there's no difference. Oh, sorry, Romarilyn, go ahead.
Yeah. What he just said, there is no difference. If you're on probation or parole, you're able to vote. So if you're on probation, it could be federal probation. You were sentenced under the federal system. It could be that you were under the local system where you're on probation, or the state system where you're on parole. But all of these systems now allow you to vote once you complete your sentence. Prior to Prop 17, no one could vote until they were off probation or parole, regardless if it was state, federal, or local.
Yeah, so we have two kindred questions. I think one from Tiffany James. I believe that lived experience is a huge factor in suggestive change. What are ways we can continue to include incarcerated individuals in the decisions surrounding our legal system? And then similarly, Georgina Guardado asked, what can the average citizen do to better support decarcerated individuals with understanding their rights? For community organizations like adult literacy, for example, what are the best resources to share with justice-involved individuals?
Well, we need another show for that. But to Tiffany's point, I think that incarcerated people should be at the table. They're the ones being impacted most often by our laws that discriminate against them. There should be a way to engage incarcerated people in the political process, whether it's through working with ARC, Initiate Justice, Californians United for a Responsible Budget, CURB, Project Rebound. There should be ways that we are thinking about intentional ways that we are engaging the incarcerated population. And I think some of these organizations are doing really good work. Some of us need to work on it a little bit more, because we need to have folks coming back to our communities informed and ready to go, ready to be the change they want to see, ready to reimagine, public safety, reimagine the criminal legal system, reimagine their communities, reimagine their own lives. And so if we continue to keep people in the dark, in these cages, in these cells, where there's little light, little access, little information, then we're setting people up for failure when they return. And so what we can do for the decarcerated population is to, number one, as taxpayers, be more involved in where your tax dollars are going. Be more involved in the state budget. Be more involved in your local representative. What are the bills that they're voting on? What are the bills that they're voting against? Does that align with your own beliefs and values? Because whether you vote for them or not, they're representing you, and they are casting their vote that creates the policy in the state. So we all need to pay more attention to who's voting for what. And if we don't like the way that they're voting on things, we need to challenge that. But specifically for the decarcerated population, make space for us when we come home. We should be in leadership roles. We have so much to give. We've survived so much, just the education and the grit that it takes to survive incarceration. You know, you should be welcoming one of us to your tables every day, because there's such a wealth of information from that individual to help drive all kinds of change within society. So do that, make space, you know, make sure there's opportunities for folks to become their best self. But also we really need to look closely at the budgets of our counties and of our state, and call our legislative officials and our elected leaders out, call them in, you know, but make sure that they are putting the money where we want our tax dollars to go. And that should be in building healthy communities, not in building prisons.
Yeah, just real quick, I'd add, like, one of the most powerful slogans of the Americans with Disabilities Act movement was, especially around disability activism, which it's there, but it's in lots of other spaces, is nothing about us without us, right? And I think what Marilyn is saying there is there's a fundamentally democratic principle, small d democratic principle here, right? And you can trace it even to maybe some of the least democratic people in the United States' history, which were some of the founders of the United States, who made a similar sort of claim, right? What does it mean to have rules made about you, rules that are focused on you, which you have no part in? Now, that's only acceptable if you don't think that this person is fundamentally a member of society. And I mean, here's the problem. Marilyn said this, and she's absolutely right. People come home. 95% of everyone who ever goes to jail and prison, they come home. This idea that people really do disappear forever, they don't. They go home, they come home, but they come home without resources. They come home with connections broken. They come home in a way where the home is no longer a place that they get to be generally a part of, right? I find myself sometimes wondering, like when I'm in, academic faculty meetings and stuff, and people get really worried, like, what if we give everyone a vote? It's like, look, if you're going to lose because you give everyone a vote, it probably means you're on the wrong side of something, right? If you're so afraid of increasing who's involved in the conversation, it's either because there's some just radical existential threat to you, which they're probably not, or what you're afraid of is that that you're not on, you might actually lose the argument. And if you don't have the right argument, then this is just, I think liberals can get behind this, conservatives can get behind this. Anybody who thinks that we should air our debates in public and come to the best possible reason means everyone needs to be at the table. And in this case, the experts, the people who know what living under incarceration is like, are the people who are precisely being excluded from the table. That tells us something about what that system is for. And it's not for safety, right? And it's not for helping people. It's for deciding that some people need to be ruled as opposed to letting them take part in self-rule. That's a little over the maybe political theory. I've got that hat on often, right? But it's like, what does it mean to say that somebody else isn't deserving of the basic autonomy that you would insist upon for yourself? That's a lot higher bar than I think we actually have in this country. Like, that's a real challenge, and we don't meet it quite often enough. If you're really that afraid of these folks being able to join you at the table, it might be time to look in the mirror and figure out what exactly it is you're afraid they're going to do differently, right? Also, if they have that many votes, you already lost. And the only thing keeping it going, right? The only thing keeping it going is the exclusion, not your argument, not being on the right side of things, right? That's what a real commitment to being part of a democracy would have to entail, I think.
Yeah, thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and there's a question from Julie Winkelstein. Thanks so much for everything that's been said. I'm interested in whether any of you have worked with libraries. Not only for their work in providing services to those who are incarcerated, but also as institutions that provide community connections, health and educational resources, information on voting and more. And I'm including both public and academic libraries. Any thoughts about the function of libraries in this conversation?
I think libraries are wonderful spaces. libraries, helped save me as a child. I love books. I love going to the library after school because sometimes going home was too chaotic. And so I have a special place in my heart for libraries and librarians. But libraries are oftentimes community centers in some neighborhoods because they may not have a community center, but that library may have a place where children can read, where meetings can be held. It may be the space. And so, I think we can continue to use our librarians to be that meeting space because it is this structure that holds so much knowledge and wealth. But I think it needs to connect sometimes a little bit more to the community and be more accessible to the community, but draw in the community. Now we see metal detectors and all kinds of things at our libraries. And, that just tells us that, the books are more important than the people. And so sometimes it's those kind of actions that, turn people away and turn people off. And so I think libraries can, go back to the way they used to make me feel as a child, that welcoming space, having events that were really public centered, community centered, and invite people in and share that knowledge with folks. So thanks for the question.
Can I jump in here? Because what you said there, Romarilyn, about as a child, your experience at home being chaotic and the library being a sanctuary. I just want to point out, I mean, I've met thousands of formerly incarcerated people. I've spoken to a number, and the number of times I've heard something like that expressed, right? Folks find themselves, and choose higher education as their transformative practice upon re-entering the community. And many have said that that a library, that a space of learning, not necessarily the school, which has often functioned in the school to prison pipeline, that has pushed folks out. But the number of folks who have called attention to libraries and spaces of learning as part of this larger conversation of safety. So what we were talking about earlier about reimagining public safety beyond police and prisons, libraries are one of those institutions, right? So for librarians to take that seriously, right, as many already do, clearly, to, as you're suggesting, Romarilyn, make those community centers welcoming, and take note of the fact that the library can be that kind of sanctuary. It can be that kind of space that provides folks safety. And so it has a role to play in this larger conversation about public safety. So we have reached 12:15, which I believe is our time to close. Any last words about work, that's left to do, that you might leave our audience members with before we turn back to Cal Humanities?
I mean, I think the library question leads to that. Wow. Investing in genuine public and a genuine public space. That's what libraries are, right? Libraries are a place that don't turn anybody away. And investing in a way of living with each other, even people you don't necessarily live with, that's invested in not turning people away and starting from a premise that, well, people have to be held accountable, that no one is disposable, right? I mean, there's the librarian's principle, right? If there's a Hippocratic oath of the librarian, it's that the doors are open, right? Maybe some of the books have to put gloves on and be careful because they're very old and they're very fragile. I don't know, right? But the idea that there is a place, and that place is maybe a physical place sometimes, a public square, a library, a community center, but that place is also like a pretty amazing imaginary space, that there could be such a thing as a nation or such a thing as a political community where no one is disposable, where no one gets left behind. I mean, that's, in a certain sense, that's the project. right? And so finding those places, so whether it's referendums on the ballot, or it's being involved in grassroots mutual aid organizations, or it's about building capacity so that we can survive this crisis and the next crisis, but that'll always happen in relation with other people. And it'll always happen where you may have to hold boundaries, and you may have to have, expectations of each other, but it's got to be a place where nobody is disposable. Nobody can simply be like placed outside the boundary of the human, or the boundary of the neighbor, or the boundary of the community, right? I mean, that's the project. Now, finding the ones on the ground, I mean, it's kind of a good litmus test. Like, what's the work they're doing? Is it about opening up space, or is it about closing down space, right? Is it about opening up possibility, or is it about restricting those possibilities?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place. Yeah, Romarilyn, go ahead.
I'll just end with a quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore: "Where life is precious, life is precious." We're all redeemable. We're all precious, and we're all deserving. So thank you, Andrew, for your comments.
Yeah. And we can create institutions that honor that preciousness, or we can create institutions that snuff it out. So I think the sentiment of aspiring toward a community in which no one is disposable, in which public institutions serve in an inclusive, an expansive conception of the public, I think is a wonderful place to end, and a wonderful place that's in the spirit, I think, of the project of the humanities. And so thank you both for joining us today, and for sharing your points of view, and educating our audience members and myself today. And thank you to California Humanities for organizing the forum, and organizing a forum around such an urgent question for us. I'll turn it back to you, Kirsten.
Thanks so much, Brady, and our thanks to you, Andrew and Romarilyn, for the illuminating and instructive and highly absorbing conversation you've just shared with us. And Brady, thank you for guiding us through all of it, as well as thanks to our audience for your very engaged and astute questions. That was a wonderful Q&A session. And for your attention today. We hope we'll see you at some upcoming programs. Our next, we'll look at voting and civic rights for immigrants to California and DACA recipients, another complicated and emerging landscape in voting. Thank you again, and thanks so much to my colleagues, Beth Segura in the background, who's been running the Zoom, Julie Fry, our president and CEO, who has been supportive through this whole series, and to all our colleagues on staff at California Humanities who helped shape this series. So we'll end with that, and I will send a recording of this session around to everyone on our list, and stay tuned next week for that. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.